So welcome to this Battle of Ideas satellite event, Populism and Identity, the Changing Face of European Democracy. As you know, my name is Rob Lyons. I work for the Institute of Ideas in London. I'm also a journalist. The Institute is an organisation that aims to encourage free thinking and open-ended public discussion. So our debates aren't party political, they're not black and white, one political position versus another, nor are they academic debates. They are about things that are in the news, are important issues in one variety or another, very current issues. And the aim is to create a space where people can think openly about the big issues of the day, whether it's politics, economics, culture or science. Each year we hold a 2-day festival of ideas in London with the Battle of Ideas, with 80 debates and hundreds of speakers. And then around that, the month before and the month after, we do satellite events across the UK, Europe, and in America as well. So we were very pleased when Johan and Oscar from Kulturhuset came to the London Festival last year and expressed an interest in working with us on a satellite event here in Stockholm. And as a result, we have this fantastic venue. We have excellent panels of speakers, and we hope you enjoy the debates. Perhaps the most important difference between Institute of Ideas events and many other debates, public debates like this one, is that half of the time is set aside for the audience to interact with the panel, to ask questions, to make comments of your own. And so please, when you're listening to the speakers make their introductions and when we talk amongst ourselves, please think about any points, questions that you have as well, and I'll come to you in due course. Now, there are 2 debates tonight. The second debate, which starts at 7:30 or thereabouts, will look at nationalism and identity. This first one is entitled The Trouble with Democracy, Populism, Technocrats and Fear of the People. The inspiration for this recent success, is the recent success across Europe of so-called populist parties that aren't part of the traditional political mainstream. So in France, the Front National won the Euro elections. In Britain, the UK Independence Party won the elections. So they're both right-wing, anti-immigration, anti-EU parties. But in Greece, it was SYRIZA that won, which is a left-wing coalition. And of course, in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats have made something of an electoral breakthrough in the past few years as well. But one part of this is to ask why people are voting for these parties and what does it say about European politics today, the attitude of the elites to the success of these parties. There is another debate that we could also have as well, and we'll see how far we get, is about the shift away from democracy among the elites. So in Italy and Greece, technocratic governments were imposed from the outside during the Euro crisis, because elected politicians weren't seen to be trustworthy when it comes to making unpleasant decisions. And even in the UK, that more and more decisions are made by experts, appointed experts, rather than by elected politicians. I'd be interested to see what people, speakers from Sweden and Germany think about that trend as well, if we have a chance to get to it. So there, the idea is democracy a barrier to getting things done? Maybe it's old hat and it's very difficult to get anything done in a democracy. I might disagree with that. Anyway, so that's the broad outline of what the speakers can cover. Let me just introduce the 3 speakers. So the first speaker is Sabine Beppler-Spahl on my far right. She studied economics at the University of Hamburg. She now works in adult education in Berlin and lectures at the University of Applied Sciences in Potsdam. She's a regular contributor to the German magazine Novo Argumente and has written for a number of well-known German publications, including Die Welt and Berliner Zeitung. Then it's Kaiser Ecke-Seckmann. Kaiser is a journalist, writer and activist. She writes for DN, is an op-ed columnist at ETC. Her latest book, Schulden, I hope I didn't mispronounce that, it describes the Euro crisis as seen from Athens and the way it's affected the Greek economy and the political landscape there. She's also the author of Being and Being Bought and is a member of the Centre for Marxist Studies in Stockholm. And the third speaker is Anna-Lena Lodinus. I probably mispronounced that as well. Anna-Lena is a journalist, author and lecturer, best known for her studies of autonomous and extreme nationalist movement. She has worked at the Olof Palme International Centre with an information project called Global Respect. Among her books, and there are many of them, so you should check those out. She wrote one in 2009 with Mats Wingbergs called Slaget am Svenskheten, which takes on the arguments of the Sweden Democrats and explains how they can be countered. And you've got a new one coming out soon, I believe, or
hopefully in the spring.
Okay, right. So
about right-wing populism.
So the way it's going to work is the speakers will have been given a very broad outline of what to speak about. So they're going to pick what they think is important and speak for about 5 to 7 minutes about that. And then we'll discuss some of the ideas amongst ourselves. And then, as I say, we'll come out to you for questions and comments. So without any further ado, Sabina.
Right. Well, one of the questions which was asked prior to this debate was whether the new populists, we're talking about UKIP in Britain and the AfD in Germany, are a threat to democracy or are opening up democratic debate. And I would then, to answer that question, go for the second and say, yes, they are opening up the debate. They do play an important role, not because of what they say, but despite of what they say. And I want to explain this because we've had in Germany in these last years a very unfortunate approach to politics, because we've seen politics more as a management exercise. So there was this very strong consensus that, as long as people gather behind our, very talented manager, Angela Merkel, things will hopefully go okay and will be all right. And that has led to problems. Not only have we seen that Germany is not doing as well as people had expected Germany to do. We've had the new figures of growth figures in the last weeks, and Germany is actually doing relatively badly. But that is just one side. But we've had, more importantly, problems of political problems. So we've had an unprecedented move away from politics in Germany. We've had 4 rather important elections this year, 3 in federal states, and we've had a voter turnout of not even 50% in some of them and maximum 50% in others, which is, quite something. That means that over 50% of the people say they have no interest in voting, and they say that whatever we vote for doesn't make a difference anyway. And that really puts the success of the established parties into a real perspective. So you could say Angela Merkel got 40%. She didn't actually get 40%. She got less than 40% in one state. It would be de facto then be 20% or less. And in this situation, we now have a new party which came up. It calls itself has the unfortunate name of Alternative für Deutschland. You might forget the Deutschland bit, but you can see that it has the word alternative in its name, and it was very consciously set up as a response to the culture of no alternative which we've had in Germany. We all remember Angela Merkel's famous dictum when she says, if the euro fails, then Europe will fail, and that will lead to a prolonged period of unpeace in Europe. Now, she got people quite scared by saying that, first of all, but secondly, I think that was quite an authoritarian thing to say, because, if you're saying there is no alternative, you're actually being quite anti-democratic, because that is what, democracy lives off. Different alternatives being presented to people having the choice, then deciding which argument is better, and hoping that the better arguments will gain the upper hand, and then also being able to shape your future as the electorate, as the demos, and holding your politicians to account at the end. And none of that is possible if we say we have a situation of no alternative. So in that sense, I think it is positive that this culture of no debate which we've had, which has probably characterized our politics in the last years most of all. We have had people who have questioned, the consensus, people who have said, well, maybe what is happening on the European level isn't so very good, or maybe the euro is a problem in all parties, but they have mostly been they have been very individual voices and often been very isolated, and some of them have then even left politics. So from that point of view, I think what has happened is positive, and there seems to be a need for that too, because this new party, the AfD, has won a respectable 10% in all these last elections, so has come out as the election winner, not in absolute terms, of course, but in relative terms. The question, is it really an alternative? Is it a good party? I think that would be quite a different question to answer. I would say no. I think that they might have the word alternative in their name. Whether they really present an alternative, is very much up to question. They do stand on two legs. They stand on an anti-Euro leg, that's the one side, but they do also have a very unfortunate anti-immigrant rhetoric. So they've had posters in the last elections, some posters in the last elections saying immigration needs to be strictly regulated. Which I would very much criticize. But here again, the problem is not this particular party. I would say the problem is the other parties who, in fact, would have nothing to counter and who say the same thing. And that is our European politics. We do have Fortress Europe. We are regulating immigration in a very, very strict way. So yes, they've kicked off a debate. Do they really present an answer? Well, I think, that is probably for others to show, to give the answers.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabina. Kajsa, your thoughts?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Och hej allihopa, kanske lite löjligt att snacka på engelska med de flesta som kan svenska, men det är inget jag åt den saken. So I'm going to go on in English. Yeah, the theme of this debate, technocrats and populists, I thought that was really good because mostly we never put these two together. Like most of the time, everybody, and this is very interesting, both the ruling class, the left, and liberals are very worried about the populists, meaning the neo-fascist parties, right? And that's what we're focusing all the time. Often talking about it in very emotional terms. Why are people voting for them? Are they racist? Are they uneducated? What is wrong with these people who are voting for them? But we never put that together with the development that, especially in Europe, the last 30 years, where politics is moving away from the people. So there we have the technocrats, which is like the ultimate event in that development now in the south of Europe. I've been writing something recently about fascism and comparing fascism in the 30s to fascism nowadays. And what's very interesting is that in the 30s, fascism was the combination of two things. On one hand, it was the angry people composed of working class, petty bourgeoisie, who basically were falling on the scale. Losing everything they had after the Great Depression. But on the other hand, fascism was also big capitalists, especially industrial capitalists in Germany and Italy, who wanted to do away with democracy that was quite young back then. Democracy hadn't been around for that long. And choosing between communism and fascism, chose fascism. So we have to see that component as well. Fascism would never have come up if it weren't also for the support of these big capitalists. So the special culture of fascism that rose up then, that speaks a very kind of vulgar or like normal language, it talks to like the everyday person, colloquial, plus the ideas that they have very much in favor of big capital. So there's like a discrepancy there. That's a special culture of fascism. But now when fascism comes back, again after a big crisis, we only have one component. We don't have the support of big capital. And that's very interesting. So as I put it, like fascism has lost its rich friend. The rich friend is not there anymore to support it. So where is the rich friend? The rich friend is engaged in democracy. No, the rich friend has other ways to do away with democracy, meaning the EU, meaning other institutions like the IMF, the WTO, free trade agreements that basically enable, as the one that is under negotiation now, enable companies to sue governments if they lose profit, things like that. So we're seeing that big capital doesn't need like a movement to stand in a square and scream to put them in power. Obviously not. They have other ways to go beyond democracy. And the EU especially is a great example of that. A lot of people tend to speak about the EU as something which was a political vision, to unite Europe and create peace and things like that, which of course is partly true, but it's as true that it was the major industrialists in Europe that got together and wanted to create a kind of capitalist state, so as to do away with different governments wanting different things and deciding different things. Basically the European capitalists, and this was back in the beginning of the 80s when they transformed the European community and the European Union. They got together, and actually it was a Swedish capitalist that took the initiative. Should I be proud? I don't think so. It was Gyllenhammar, the Volvo guy. So he called up all the other capitalists in Europe and said, hey, you know, Japan is going ahead, the US is going ahead, and we're lagging behind. You know, why are we lagging behind? Because we have all these social democrats everywhere that are deciding different things. We can't have a common market. So they got together, and this is so interesting because it also goes against the idea that we're living in a neoliberal era. Because there's nothing neoliberal about the creation of the EU. It's a capitalist kind of state. You know, neoliberalism is supposed to be against the state and wanting to free themselves from the state. But here we have the creation of a national state where decisions are increasingly being taken with companies. If you look at different branches, you see that the companies are really sitting there and doing the research and deciding together with the EU Commission. So where am I getting with all this? Don't know. Got lost in my train of thought. No, but I think we have to see these two forces of fascism are still here. They're just not together. We have the anti-democratic tendency of capital, and we also have the anger of the people that are very much reacting to this anti-democratic tendency of the capital, actually. But now we're seeing these forces are kind of getting close again. Now we're seeing that the right-wing parties, traditional right-wing parties, just as the industrialists, are speaking about, you know, should we talk to this new Sweden Democrats? Should we talk to these nationalist parties? Maybe we can find agreements, you know. So maybe these two forces that have like gone different directions are going to get back together again. And I'm wondering, like, how is that going to look? But I think I've talked too much.
No, that's perfect timing. Thank you very much, Kajsa. Anna-Lena.
So of course, there are a lot of things that you said that I wanted to comment on, but maybe I should stick to my original plan. But one thing I must say about the things that you discussed, this shows a little about the differences between the debate in the rest of Europe and in Sweden, I think. Because we have a tendency in Sweden to label everything as fascism, and in the rest of Europe, we have a different setup. Because we see that we have big parties that are more or less part of the establishment. They are growing. They are not considered to be some part of Weimar Republic or something with roots in the Third Reich or something. They are something considered to be something more new and modern. And in the Swedish setup, we consider to be different. And that part of the reason is because the party that we have, Sweden Democrats, they are different from many other parties in Europe because they have a background. They have roots in some neo-Nazi surroundings. They had people starting the party that had that kind of background. In most countries, this is not. One thing that makes it more complicated to talk about these things in Sweden as well as in other countries is that you have such a broad range of parties. In fact, some of them would be quite moderate in some ways, like UKIP and Alternative for Deutschland. They would be liberal. Then we talk about economic issues. They would be liberals, for instance. They have loads of things that they're talking about, and migration would be one thing. It would not be the core issue. It would be one amongst many things that they would talk about. And for the Sweden Democrats, migration would be everything. You can talk about them, raise any question, and they would end up in talking about migration. So we are somewhat different from the rest. And I also can see that actually goes for media sometimes in the rest of Europe as well, that when you give you examples of right-wing populism and extremism, and often you take these things together and say it's more or less the same, which I think it's not actually. In some ways, but in some ways not. Then you would give examples from Greece. You would say that Golden Dawn, that is an example of what's happening. Or they would talk about Jobbik in Hungary, also another very extreme organization. And then they would show, and they are bigger and bigger, and they're growing. And then they would point to UKIP in Britain and say that they are this big in Britain. And they would say that Alternative for Deutschland, they are really growing quickly because it's rapidly. It's been a year or something more.
Yeah, a year. They were founded a year ago, yeah.
So this is it's a growth that you can really point to and say, oh, this is what's happening in Germany. And then people will say, oh, this is the country where Hitler was. And in fact, can you really say that? I mean, because you've seen for so many years that neo-Nazis in Germany, they are not that big. Of course, we have one now in the EU Parliament, and that's another question we could raise. But they've been trying for many, many years, and they
would never have this kind of success that Alternative for Deutschland seems to have now. And the reason is partly because they are more moderate. They are keeping a somewhat lower profile, which means that people are not put off and they are not stigmatized in the same way as if they had been pointing to more extreme things and talking about tearing down democracy or whatever. So this makes it all a bit complicated, I think. And also this difference between Sweden and the rest of Europe, I think is important to talk about. Just a few things that I want to say. One thing is that they're growing everywhere. Everybody says, oh, it's growing and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger everywhere. It's not true. In some countries, they are growing. In other countries, they're not. Looking at Eastern Europe, for instance, they have lost ground in most countries. Hungary would be an exception, Latvia as well. But in many other countries in Eastern Europe, they are more or less erased. You're not even talking about them anymore. And why is that? This is an issue that we could talk about for hours. So this is important to understand. And this thing also that what we consider to be extreme in Sweden would be different from other countries. As I'm writing right now about this, I was investigating Czech Republic, for instance. And then this former dissident, Jiří Palas, he told me that in Czech Republic, all parties would be xenophobic and against gypsies. And so they would consider the Sweden Democrats to be soft on those things, actually. So they don't need a party like that because everybody agree on this. So what is extreme in Sweden would be soft in Czech Republic. So so when we talk about these things, we are talking about, we are not actually talking about the same things, even if we think that we are. So I want to say one thing more about this voting behavior, because this is something that you can see everywhere, and I think it has a lot to do with why people are choosing these parties, because it's not because they are more xenophobic. It's not, people are not more xenophobic than they used to be, and this is in all countries in Europe. Another thing is that when you get those kind of parties and they are growing, it doesn't mean that people are getting to be more xenophobic. It's not as clear as that. So why would they vote for them? Of course, there are many reasons. One reason would be that they think they are different, because they think that the other parties are more or less the same. And certainly when you talk about economic things, you could see that liberal economy, privatization, small public sector, those kind of things, they would agree on left and right nowadays. And this is conservative parties. They have a total different agenda, which means that they present themselves differently. And this is attractive. They're conservative. They like old-fashioned families. They don't like abortions, same-sex marriages. Lots of things they say that the others are not talking about, which makes them different. And people might agree on that. And then we had another thing, that they are attracted to the things that they say, because they were the first ones to talk about the problems with multicultural society in connection with welfare state, that there is a problem if we have a more global society, that we might not get enough money to have a proper welfare state. And they would also point to the problem with the Islamists, which is a growing problem. Everybody talks about that now, but before, for a few years ago, they were the only ones, which makes them the different party, the party that's an agenda that they were the first ones to have. And then the other ones will copy. That's how people look at it. And the last thing that I should say is that they also have another thing that might be lacking a little bit, going back to this thing with the professionalism of politics, that they have the passion. They are pioneers, they are stigmatized, they are somewhat standing outside, looking into the establishment. And in some ways, this is something that's quite attractive. Some people will see this to be a good thing, because they looked upon themselves as the losers of modernization, the ones that the globalization left behind. And then they will see that this is my party, because they are also outside the establishment, just as me.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna-Lena. So to take up some of the themes that Anna-Lena was talking about, Sabina, is it even worth talking about a trend across Europe in these terms? Because, as Anna-Lena's been saying, that the parties involved are actually all very different. Even UKIP.
Are somewhat similar to each other.
Yeah, there are some similarities, but there are also quite a lot of differences, especially with something like SYRIZA versus Sweden Democrats. They're very different. So, is there? To what extent are there similarities? Is there something similar going on in these countries, and to what extent is it different?
Well, I think similar is definitely, as you said, this move away from established politics. Established politics telling people less, obviously representing people less, and people feeling this very strong discontentment. And yes, in some countries it takes on different forms. I mean, in Germany it's very clear that nobody would say that they are fascists. Nobody would say that. I think there are some worrying trends, though, and I think that they are similar in terms of these parties presenting alternatives, because they do, all of them in some ways, relate to the idea of competition, of how do we distribute resources. There is a sort of narrowing down of perspectives and perceptions, and I would say across the board. I mean, even including perhaps SYRIZA. None of these parties actually say, well, how can we solve these problems together? What unites us in Europe? I mean, that's the first thing. Everybody kind of looking at their own, not looking beyond their own. The Germans would say beyond their own plate. Looking at other countries as the problem. I mean, Germany does that very much in a very, very awful and horrible way, pointing the finger at the Greeks, saying, oh, now we have to support these Greeks and they have been lazy all these years, which is so negative, rather than looking at their own mistakes. Why was it that Greece could get into that situation in the first place? What was the responsibility of German banks? Things like that. But the same thing goes on in France. French people saying, well, look at Germany, we're being bullied around by Angela Merkel. And, the Greeks too have their grievances. So I think that is a very negative thing, and does sort of, is perhaps a common element, rather, it's not really a progressive drive to overcome some of these cultural problems, I would say, we have in Europe, things, asking what really is keeping us back. We have everything going for ourselves in Europe. We have good people, we have technology, what exactly is stopping us? And I think that would be the kind of question I'd like to address.
Okay. Kaisi, feel free to comment on that as well, but one thing that kind of might flow from what you were saying was about this turn towards the technocrats, is that they could almost use the voting for populist parties as a justification for what they're doing. So, if, for example, in Greece, the idea that with all these extremists around, that they won't stick to the budgets and whatever, that's why we need to have a technocratic government in. Do you see that that's a possibility, that actually, in the reaction to the failures of the mainstream parties, the populist vote may actually justify anti-democracy or technocracy?
No, I'm not sure, because the technocrats came before Golden Dawn. Right. So, but actually, I have to say about the term populist, I think it's so vague. I think it's mainly used to denote like a popular party that one doesn't like personally. Yeah. It's like popular, but with a kind of negative tinge. And if you think about it, the so-called populist parties from the right, I don't think they have that much in common with what you call, for example, the populist parties from the left. It's very different roots, very different goals. I would say actually SYRIZA is, the Greek left party. They are trying to talk for the whole of Europe. They're not just looking at their own country. Really, in their rhetoric, it's very clear that they're speaking about, Europe will sink if we don't go back to democracy, if we don't make another kind of European Union. They're not actually even against the European Union, as some people even think they are. So they really have, and especially in the south of Europe, a kind of new vision. And I think that's very interesting, actually, how in Greece the left has managed to unite people, and it hasn't really been the far right. I saw all that when I was there. I was there for 2.5 years, and it was very clear, first of all, that fascism, because in Greece, I don't think Sweden is that special, by the way, because the Golden Dawn party in Greece is very clearly a Nazi party. You know, the leader says, my hands might have done this, but they have never stolen, right? And so it was very clear that it was after technocratic rule, it was after Greece had ceased to be an independent country, after it basically came under the control of the Troika, and the Troika even demanded that Greece change the constitution and write in the constitution that the payment of debt goes before everything else. So before you pay to your hospitals, to your schools, to your welfare, you have to pay off your debts. And also placing the debts under British law, where it's very favorable to the lender, and it's almost impossible to get out of your responsibility if you are a country that's been borrowing money. So all these things were happening. And of course, it wasn't until after that the far right or the Nazis started gaining ground. And it was very clearly a response to the crisis. And I could see it almost in a metaphysical sense that first people were out demonstrating. They were against power. They were against the Troika. They were looking upwards, you know, saying like the blame we should find it up there. After that, when the power didn't respond, and when instead of a prime minister, you had a technocrat that wasn't even elected by the people, you could notice that people started putting the blame on the ones that were poorer than themselves. Because power wasn't reachable. So they started to say, oh, look at this immigrant, this paperless person that's searching for food in the trash. It's partly him. It's his fault. So in Greece, you can really see the development in a concentrated form. It happened so fast. But then you can see how the left actually has managed to create a movement that's very popular and that manages to include everyone, which they haven't in a lot of other countries. So I think there's a lot we can learn there.
Okay. So following on from what you say, Anna-Lena, is there anything more to this than just random protest votes in different countries that it just would the particular is there any, first of all, general thing that we should be looking at, and secondly, is it got any legs, and it just happens to be that in one country it's a conservative party like UKIP, and another one it's a neo-fascist like Golden Dawn, or just whatever happens to be going on at the time.
To be honest, I think that we have to see that the Golden Dawn would be another party that's very extreme, that has these Nazi roots, but still they are in minority. Most of the other parties would not have that background and all this. But of course, what goes for many countries in Europe is that we have this kind of alienation to politics and to democracy, and that is part of the reason why people are voting for all these parties, and they might be different from each other, and the setup will be different from one country to another. But why people are going for these kind of alternatives could be similar somehow. And I was talking about this, that the left and the right would be more and more similar when I'm talking about the employment and the economy and those kinds. You would not have that much difference. And of course, the workers' movement started off once a long time ago because you had this class war between the employers and the workers, and you wanted to change things, the circumstances for living and the money you get when you work and all this the basic things. And if that is why you want to go for a party, you won't find it in workers' parties anymore, because most parties will be more for middle-class voters, and they will be having quite a different setup. And because of this, that they are so similar in economic things, the debate will be only about values. So the value debate has grown, and that's migration will be one important part of that. But the Islamization of Europe would be another part, another discussion. Gender equality, all these kind of issues would fit into this. And then you will see that there's a big variety, because parties will say very differently. I mean, you could separate them from each other in a very clear way, which means that so what has happened is that conservative workers, they are going for these kind of parties, because they are not believing that the left parties will give them better opportunities, and they are very conservative when it comes to gender equality, family values or whatever. They always were, but they still voted for the left because they believed that this would be a better society for them.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting you raised this issue of class, because one of the big debates in Britain over the past 2 or 3 months has been the independence referendum for Scotland. And so it seems on the surface, are people Scottish nationalists as opposed to British nationalists? You know, is there any... but actually, the reason why the debate ended up being... the vote being relatively close, because for a long time people thought just there's no way Scotland's going to vote for independence, and then at the end it was very, very it seemed like it was going to be very close. It was working class people in Glasgow and in the other big cities who, feeling unrepresented by the Labour Party, the party that they traditionally went for, were saying, well, we should just try something different. We're not particularly Scottish nationalists, but, you know, we need to get away from London politics. Nobody represents us. Maybe we can do something better in Scotland.
And this is part of the same things that are happening in Europe, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So let me take this out to the audience now. Has anybody got any points or questions?
The mics are here. Yes, and questions preferably in English. If you feel uncomfortable, we'll have translation by Natalie here, so you can ask your questions in Swedish as well.
Okay.
Good evening. My name is Fredrik, and I'm from Amoristerna. It's a congregation. And I have a question about this fascism. What is your definition of that? I heard that it's some kind of social idea that people are going to own together and things like that. And do you have any idea of that or some reference?
Okay. Is there any more at the moment? I'll take 2 or 3 and then take the panel and give them a rest. Everybody's being really quiet.
Yeah, my name is Åsa Stensvik, and I'm wondering, in Sweden, the leader of the Sverigedemokraterna, or the party that we have, Jimmie Åkesson, he's sometimes put forward as he's kind of the creator of the party, that it would never have gone that far without him, and he's kind of also looked upon sometimes, I think, as the one person that's kind of keeping calm, and he has this wild hooligan party around him, and he's kind of managing to keep it decent so that they reach so many votes as they do. This is kind of a picture that I've seen being put forward. So my question is, the leader of these parties, is that different from like the conventional parties? Are they usually looked upon as the creator of their party? And because now the Jimmie Åkesson has stepped down, and everyone is wondering what's happening now with the populist party that we have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, someone over here.
Yeah, hello. My name is Eric. I study engineering here at KTH. My question revolves the power to the people. Just like a general question about giving more power to the people somehow, or giving less power to the people. I don't know how, but I mean, in some sense, making sure that there is a specific problem in one country, and giving the people a vote to to answer that sort of problem, instead of you know, like making another vote and just voting for that type of question in that country. So
Okay, maybe one more. Okay, so we have what is this fascism thing anyway? We have are these leaders different in some way? Are they? And we have this question about power to the people. So answer whatever you want, or whatever you don't want to answer. You can ignore. It's fine. Sabina, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think the question about the leader is very interesting. I mean, these parties do have different histories. So, for example, the UKIP, I've just read a book about UKIP, has been around for quite a long time, while, as you said, AFD has only just been founded last year. And UKIP had a long history, but it had different types of leaders and was very different, not always very successful. But now it has a very kind of charismatic Nigel Farage, very envious. I envy it sometimes coming from Germany. You know, you see him smoking and drinking and laughing and, you know, really, you know, showing up 2 fingers against the establishment, saying, you know, like you said, I represent the normal people who have for years been told that they're not allowed to do what they actually, you know, like to do, that their life has been
like smoking,
you know,
in the pub,
like
smoking.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yes, I agree with that too. And there we have this quite charismatic person, and yeah, I think perhaps due to that, the UKIP has become so strong. In Germany, it's quite different. You know, we have Mr. Lucke, who is a veritable Calvinist compared to Mr. Farage. You know, he's very, very, you know, quite uncharismatic, I would say. I don't know whether...
I actually met him once. So.
Yeah, and even worse, we had... and others on the board who, you know, who you would basically... I mean, they were the other board members were obviously in part people who were for very long quite at the edge of society, so in specific religious groups. So I think there it's more that the parties become big despite, you know, that leadership. It's just, you know, just to show that, as I said, finally there is another party which people can vote for, an alternative. I think it's interesting in some ways that they've gotten, on one hand, they've gotten very many votes in Germany. On the other hand, they haven't gotten that many votes either. It's 10%, which is very good for a new party.
Particularly in Germany.
Yes, it's very good, particularly in Germany. But because you mentioned the fascists, in that particular state, the former fascist party, the NPD, was actually kicked out of parliament in these last elections. So they're not in parliament anymore at all. They've become... you know, negligible. And most people, even though the AFD stood for election and the fascists stood for elections and others, most people still didn't vote. So it shows they don't quite trust the AFD, you know, and they're still, you know, waiting. They can't see themselves represented. And I think that is the problem, that people don't see themselves represented. And I think they're right, you know, they're not being represented. They haven't, you know, their main issues haven't been addressed. And, you know, and now we have to see which direction will this take, what form will protest take. Will there be protest or will there be passivity, you know?
Kaiser?
Yeah, I think it's a bit typical that we, in this debate, when we were going to speak about, you know, populism and technocrats, we ended up just with the populists and nobody's speaking about the technocrats, because I think, you know, and that's very typical, like, and it's part of this big game, which I would call blaming the people. You know, it's always the people's fault in one way or the other. Just the way that, you know, the German media was blaming the Greek people for the crisis, and the Greek people in turn blame the immigrants, and so on. And the game just goes that way. I mean, I think instead, because as long as we keep on talking about, oh, the people voting for these right-wing parties, they are a problem. I mean, that just makes more people vote for them. Like, I almost feel like voting for them when they're talking so bad about them, you know? And I think we need to look at who has the real power, who caused the crisis. It wasn't the common people. It wasn't the Greek workers. It wasn't the immigrants. It was the big financial classes, the big industrialists, and the European common currency, which also has a reason if you go back to how it was imposed with the different exchange rates for the North and the South in Europe, that it wasn't a currency for the South, really. It was a loss for them to join that currency. But anyway, so, and I've noticed when I'm trying to figure out what's happening with all these, you know, IMF things with the EU, it's very difficult to penetrate. And I think in Sweden we have the worst EU journalism in the whole of Europe, actually. We seldom find out what's happening in the EU and in the EU Commission and what they actually do. And it's a power that's invisible. It's a power that you might not call it technocratic, but that's definitely how it works. Instead of having a leadership cult where everybody has to have a picture picture of the leader and worship him. I mean, that's old style. Nowadays, the people who have the power don't want to be seen. I mean, they don't want to be named. You're not supposed to know who they are. So I think that's what we have to look at. Start naming these people, start finding out who is taking the decision in the EU, who is taking the decisions when it comes to all the IMF things, what interests are behind, and start uncovering that. Because in that way, we can unite parts of what is the discontent that's now been split into left and right. Because those things that are happening don't benefit anyone. But instead, pointing finger at people and saying, you're racist, or you're this, or you're that, this I don't think gains anyone. And about fascism, the definition of fascism, I mean, there's 100 definitions of fascism. It depends on what researcher you want to look at. But part of the definition would be, for example, fascism is corporativism. It has a strong leadership cult. Could have racism involved, but not necessarily. In Italy, for example, with Mussolini, it didn't have at least in the beginning, a very strong racist idea. Very male-oriented, patriarchal ideals. Also has this idea that society has degenerated and has to be born again. And very specifically, fascist parties think that there's no such thing as left or right. They're beyond left or right, whereas in reality they're often very right-wing. They vote with the right wing, but the rhetoric is generally they're beyond left and right. But of course there are so many more definitions than that.
Let me challenge. I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here and say, well, maybe we get the governments we do deserve. Maybe it is the people's fault. I mean, this is not my argument, by the way. This is, but I used to sell left-wing magazines a lot in the 90s, and a lot of people would come up to say, never mind, mate, it's all the people that are stupid, we agree, but, and it's like that sense of...
People's always somebody else, huh?
Yeah, it's always somebody else's fault, but maybe that's true. Maybe it's just that we've been too passive, people have been too passive, and it's ordinary people's fault. And so and if democracy gets taken away from us, well, that's what we deserve.
We deserve better.
Yeah.
We deserve way better.
Okay. Any comments on anything you want?
A few things. This thing with the leadership, I would say it's very important for many of those parties that we're talking about, but maybe less in the ones that you have in your countries, like UKIP and AFD, because they are more of a traditional parties in many ways. And they differ from some of the others that we're talking about. Like Marine Le Pen would be extremely important. Like your father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, he was also that kind of charismatic leader that's an essential person for the party. Without them, no party, more or less. I would not say it really goes for Jimmy Åkesson. I mean, many people would say he's that kind of important person. But I would say Sweden Democrats would be more like Frans Belang in Belgium, for instance, or the Danish Folk Party. They consist of a small group of important people. And they have a strong connection with each other, and they decide everything in the party. It's a group of like 4, 5, 6 people, and you can see that in many countries. And then they picked Jimmy Åkesson because they agreed on that he was the best one to present them as a group. So he's in the front line, but there are others back of him. So that's one thing I think is important to point out. I mean, Nigel Farage, he might be a very charismatic person, but he stepped out. I mean, very recently he said, I'm not doing this anymore. And he went out for a while, and then they actually said, you're going to come back, and then they convinced him. And he was very negative to that to begin with. But what you can see is that the democratic structures in these kind of parties are often weak. If you're a member in that kind of party, the possibilities for you to move forward and make any difference in the party, it's more of a church. I mean, you know what you agree on, and you worship the ideas of the party, but you're not really making any difference because other people are deciding what it's all about. So it's more like that, particularly in France and those kind of model parties for a right-wing populist party. That's what most scientists would say they are. They're like the role model. And then you have all these kind of variations. I'm not going to say so much about fascists because you described the sort of classical definition. There are many ways of describing it. But I would say that I would not use it so much for a party that still believes in democracy. They might have... They might lack in democratic structures, but I cannot see that UKIP or Alternative for Deutschland or actually Sweden Democrats would change the parliamentary system that we actually have today in Sweden. They are still within the system. And that makes them different from like many of the other parties in Europe. That's more extreme. So I would say fascists, when we talk about more openly undemocratic parties, then I would use fascism as a description.
Okay. Any comments on anything? Can I just do an opinion poll? Just to see.
How many are fascist?
How many? Yes. Put your hand up like that. No, don't.
God.
How many people think that these parties, Sweden Democrats, UKIP, whatever, how many people think they are a flash in the pan, they're just a protest and be gone in 5 years? And how many people think this is something new in politics today? So all the people who think it's just a protest vote, put your hands up. Nobody thinks it's... Sorry, so who thinks that the Sweden Democrats, UKIP, to the extent that they have something in common, are just a protest vote, and in 5 years' time, the protest will be over, or another party will be... And to what extent do you think that there's something real, there's a real change in politics going on that's going to last? So
they're here to stay, basically.
Yeah,
they're standing for a tremendous change of politics.
You put it more simply. Are they here to stay? Yes or no? So who thinks they're here to stay? All right. Okay. Interesting. Who thinks they won't last? Okay. So please tell me what you.
Are you guys being pessimist or optimist now? That's what I don't know.
So please stick your hand up again and tell me why you voted one way or the other. So. Yeah, the gentleman here.
Well, I think that maybe fascist parties and racist parties are connected to recession. And if I would be positive or on the outlook on the future, I think that the recession will not last for another 5 years. Thus, excusing, or the people will probably not blame other people or race for the recession, because now we're prospering and the economy is growing and stuff like that. So therefore, I think these type of parties are unique to the current problem. And if the economy is going up, then the problem doesn't exist.
Okay. So let's. Right. Who voted yes? Who thinks they're here to stay? No. I've had you over in the corner there. Is there a microphone over there? No. Oh. Here we go. It's dashing across. Sorry, our other microphone person's disappeared. That's why.
So
Hello.
I think that as long as other parties won't change their policies, these parties are here to stay. And as far as I've seen, other parties are not changing their policies. So I guess I'm pessimistic, but I think they will just prosper, especially in Sweden, where we do not talk to these parties, and we treat them like very separate, like very different.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And we could also. I'm also interested in views on Kaiser's question, which is actually we're worrying about the wrong thing, and actually it's the technocrats we should be worrying about, and this is just a lot of noise in the foreground. Whatever. So this view here. Yeah.
There's one here.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realise you. I thought you'd gone off to pre-chair. Sorry. Go on. Yes.
I didn't vote actually. On the
Could you speak into the microphone?
I didn't vote on the question, they're here to stay, or if it's only kind of temporary thing, because I don't think they seem to tackle the problem, which is the actual resources, who owns resources, and they blame not the people who are causing the problem. So even if they stay, they will not tackle the problem. And as the policymakers, they don't address this question. But on the other hand, the policies that are in power now, they don't seem to do it either. Mm-hmm. And that only will make people angry. So I don't really know if
Okay.
it's a solution.
Okay. More views? That's one, yeah.
Go ahead. Oh, yeah. Well, I want to comment on both kind of questions, actually. Coming from Greece, Greece is kind of my case study, and I think it's generally interesting also because a lot of people in Greece, at least, see similarities with the German situation between the two world wars, in the sense that both nations have been shamed, and there's economic recession, and there is a great hostility towards foreigners, immigrants, and specific groups of the population are being targeted. And also another similarity and a very interesting point that connects to the technocrats and the established political powers is their connection to the political and economical elites of the country, which has been proven in many, many instances. And inside the parliament, they have voted in favor of all the regulations in favor of big capital in this country. So I think that is a very important point to look at, how these parties connect to the establishment, to the political and economical elites in each country. And one small comment also, that in Greece, again, we had a party before the Golden Dawn that was very similar to the Sverigedemokraterna, in the way that they were more moderate, that they weren't outspokenly neo-Nazis, they weren't outspokenly racist. And what they essentially did was side with the big parties. So the people that found their ideas attractive, they turned to the more extreme right, which was Golden Dawn. And it would be interesting also in the Swedish context and in every country actually to look at what is further right and what is more extreme. Because when this moderate expression of these ideas fades out or proves their inconsistencies, then the people that favor them will turn more to the right.
Do you think, sorry, just to ask you, do you think the Golden Dawn succeeded because of the crisis, and that this other party might have survived longer if it wasn't for the extreme nature of the crisis? Or do you think Golden Dawn were always going to be the logical conclusion of that?
I think they succeeded because the right-wing solution, which was the previous party, Laos, they proved to be liars. They didn't stick to their ideas. And also, another component that is important to look at, there is no strong counter movement existing in Greece. Yeah. The left is very moderate. The only groups that are actively counter-fighting in terms of actual violence and actually defending the people that are being targeted are very small anarchists or far leftist groups. So there's no constructed and strong counter movement at this point in Greece, at least. And this, I think, is also a very important component in terms of the responsibility of the people, how we respond and how far we want to go to counterfight these tendencies in society.
Okay, thank you. I'll take one more, if there's one more, before we take the panel. Oh, lots of people. Right. You, sir, here.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at the question of whether the rise of these parties are negative or positive. And I think a positive aspect is that I think the massive success that most of these parties have had, and at least if you look at the moderate ones, then I think it can be important to realize that they are able to provoke a change in how the established parties do politics, and also how they can respond more timely to changing surrounding, how people reason and how people want to tackle or are prepared to tackle challenges in society, and that they are not prepared maybe to wait for a very long process to end and so on, and with consensus and so on. That is it the correct way to address issues, to be more drastic, or should we stick to the old school with more consensus oriented and more investigations and so on? And at least that it provokes thoughts around these issues, I think can be healthy actually.
Okay, so I'm going to bring the panel back in. You can pick up on one or two things each. Don't have to answer everything. Then we'll go out for one more round of comments before you sum up. So I'm going to start in reverse order for a change. So Anna-Lena.
One thing about the crisis, I mean, you can see that in some countries it's probably because of the crisis that these kind of movements are growing. I found another example eventually recently. You always say that Iceland didn't have any kind of those kind of parties, but then I suddenly discovered that Reykjavik actually had a populist party for just after the crisis, and they were more left-wing oriented, but still you can see that they voted for them as a protest. This was more like left-wing anarchists, you could say, to put it simple. But on the other hand, like in Spain, in Portugal, Ireland, no populist parties. And some fairly rich countries like Switzerland, Norway for sure, they have big parties. So it's not as simple as that. On the other hand, you can see if you go to every single country that might be that those people that are mostly affected by the crisis, they would be more eager to vote for a right-wing populist party. So it's all a little bit more complicated, I would say. One thing, what's going to happen if we have these kind of parties? What will happen? Will they eventually just be left out, or will they stay forever, or whatever? What will happen? And what I've found is that the most likely thing that will happen is that they actually fall apart because they're quarreling internally. So it's not what people are doing from outside, that they will lose ground because something is happening within the party. Or what has happened in some countries is that a more extreme party, quite different from Greece actually, like in Belgium, they had a more extreme party, and then they're losing ground because suddenly a more moderate party will turn up, and they present themselves in a different way, and then people say that they are a better alternative for us. And the third thing that can happen, that's actually happening in Norway right now, I think, is that when they're suddenly in power, they might lose because of that. Because then people will say that, I mean, now you're behaving the same as everybody else. You're not in opposition anymore. You're not anti-establishment. So I mean, the Progress Party in Norway, they are very weak right now. The figures are going straight down. They haven't been this low for so many years as they are right now. So. But the last thing, but what is actually happening in some countries like Denmark is that they are somewhat getting in power, and then they're influencing all the others. So I mean, in Denmark, it doesn't matter what party you're voting for because they will all agree on the same immigration policies. So they don't need Danish Folk Party maybe anymore because, I mean, they got a left-wing government and they're operating exactly the same way, more or less, as the right-wing government did.
Okay. Kaisa.
Yeah, first, just a disclaimer. I don't just think that, it's just a lot of noise, as you were saying before. I mean, I think especially when we're talking about fascists on the street, I mean, that's a real physical threat. And that's happening in a lot of European countries, that fascist groups are going around killing people, stabbing people, threatening people, mostly paperless people, immigrants. But, I mean, they're basically making life unsafe for a lot of people. So that, of course, has to be stopped. And as the Greek comrade was saying here, it's true that in Greece the established left has been very bad at confronting street fascism. It's basically anarchists that are taking up the fight, and the police, unfortunately, is with these street fascists most of the time in Greece. I mean, I've seen videos on YouTube where fascists are beating up an immigrant, and the police comes and says, "Just go on," you know, and actually some of them even take part in the beating. What I do think, though, is that fascist or neo-fascist parties are not the cause, they're the consequence, and that's the important distinction to make. It wasn't like life was perfectly fine and then they came up and now we're sitting here worried and like crossing the middle-class legs and saying, "Oh, what is happening?" You know? Hasn't been like that. If we look at the last 30 years of European and Western politics, we see that the class gaps have been increasing enormously. We see that in parts of Europe, the difference between the classes is back to where it was in the beginning of the 20th century. We see that poverty is back, that child poverty is back. We even see in Europe that there are some people who are so poor that they don't have any other choice but to go from country to country to beg. And in Sweden, actually, it's the OECD country where gaps are increasing the most. We also see democracies moving away from the people, moving into institutions where bureaucrats and industrialists are sitting, deciding things together that the people have no idea about. We see that our common assets are being privatized and sold out. Right now in Sweden, any company can buy a school, get money from the state, make profit, put half of the money in Cayman Islands and then go bankrupt. You know, I was talking to right-wing politicians in Greece and they were like, what, you're privatizing schools? We would never do that. I mean, that's a right-wing politician that says that. And here in Sweden, even the social democrats won't do away with that. So whether this change is taking place as a shock doctrine type of thing like in Greece, or whether it's a slow therapy like it's been in Sweden, we see a big change. A real big change. That is the problem. That needs to be addressed. Whatever we're seeing after that is a consequence that needs to be addressed and fought against as well. But when you're starting to formulate that as the problem, I think you're entering into the same circle.
Okay, Sabina.
Yeah, I think this whole thing is much less rational than it appears, and we've also in terms of crisis and recession. So we've had this very strange paradox in Germany, is that studies show again and again that immigration is actually very positive for the German economy, and yet, you know, a big group of people is very skeptical. And the question is, how does that fit together? It's because there is something else going on. It's not really the economic question. It's more that people feel that the immigration is they're losing control over their own environment, their own sort of society, and that's a very annoying thing which has happened, that actually the immigration issue has become a catalyst for people's discontentment with politics. And here I think there we have to go back to the technocrats, because I think the fault lies indeed with the technocrats and with the European Union. So we've had, you know, basically a very positive thing happening earlier this year, in January, when the borders were finally opened for Bulgarian and Romanian workers, which you could say was long overdue. If we say we're one Europe, you know, why would we have a Europe of two classes where one section of the population is not allowed to go and work somewhere else? I'm allowed to come to Sweden and work. Why should Bulgarians not be allowed to come to Germany? So you could have celebrated this as a gain of freedom for many people, as the Germans also, by the way, celebrated the freedom they gained from the fall of the Berlin Wall, which we're celebrating this week. But rather than presenting it in this way, the government was, you know, doing what it always does, hiding behind EU policy, saying it was like a deadline coming closer and closer, leaving the debate completely to the conservative, or you could more right-wingers, who then said, oh my God, what is going to happen? And then they became very defensive, and then they said, well, you know, it's because of the EU, we can't do anything about it. And worst of all, they actually even turned to Switzerland after that vote against mass immigration and said, you know, we don't agree with the Swiss because what they're doing is raisin picking. Yeah, they want to negotiate, they want to cooperate with the EU, but choose only the positive things and not the negative things. You know, I mean, saying immigration is obviously something so negative that the Swiss are raisin picking by not accepting it. And I think that is, you know, that is really very, very negative, and that is what's happened. And then people say, well, why is the EU imposing this policy onto us, and you know, and reacting against it? And I think that is the problem. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for the.
Okay, so we'll take one more round. So I'm going to bring the panel back after whatever final points people want to make, and give them a minute each, which is cruel, I'm sorry, but there you go, a minute each to kind of sum up, well, whatever takeaway point they would like to leave you with. So any final points from you? Now, there was a hand over there, is that still? Yes.
Yeah, so seeing these current, let's call them fascist party movements as perhaps a reaction to a very big schism between technocrats and population, what do you think would be a more moderate reaction and way of solving that issue, which is a major schism between those in power and the people voting for people not really being in power?
Okay. This gentleman's been very persistent, so I'm going to let him speak again. Yes, okay. So if I take that question there, then I'll take you. sorry.
Just a short question about the comment you did about the anonymous poverty, the power of the EU. When I was talking with people just in the streets or in the shops before the election here in Sweden, I was astonished that many of them who told me that they're going to vote for the Swedish Democrats actually were from the Eastern Europe or foreigners. And that was a little bit astonishing for me. But the comment that they told me was that we are afraid of something like the Iron Curtain or the totalitarian that they had experienced from in the Eastern Europe before. So that was interesting reflection about the voters in Sweden.
Okay. Why? They thought the Iron Curtain was going to come again if they didn't vote for them, or what?
They were afraid of that, and they were afraid, and they had some feelings of that tendency in the Swedish society that they were not feeling good of. So that was more some kind of protest vote, but not Swedish people, but Eastern Yugoslavians, Polish people, and
okay, okay.
Yes. Do you see any difference between the movements, the nationalist movements in the 1930s and in Spain, even after the Second World War, and nowadays? Why didn't this pop up in Britain and Sweden during the oil crisis in the 70s, etc.? Do you see anything new, or are there other factors?
Okay. Any final points? Yes, there's one over here. Awesome.
Hello. Yeah, so this is just a quick question for Kajsa, going back to something you said earlier. That I think you said something about how SYRIZA could probably, how they have united people in Greece could be a lesson for other parties, I guess, other left-wing parties then. So what do you think that, for example, the Swedish left party could take away from the SYRIZA example?
Okay, and pass the microphone just here as well, please. Thanks.
Thanks, hi. I don't remember which of you talked about the fact that actually those parties are growing, but it's not as big as it is shown. And my question or my point is more about the media and how it is perceived, because we get a lot of fears and we get a lot of attention to those parties, but actually, is it like, what is the role of the media in communicating the fear and like the idea of that those parties are getting big? And I guess, well, my point is that media have also a big role in giving them votes, because by making them bigger than they are, I guess people think that they can vote for them.
Okay. One more, just one more. Oh, okay, sorry. Two more then. Sorry, yes, go ahead.
Shall I go? Okay. Yeah, I think one factor that you have to consider is also globalization, that people are more intertwined nowadays, that we get people from India or China working here, and instead of like for 30 years ago it was much harder to come work elsewhere in the world, so we're more intertwined in the world today.
Okay. So that final point over here, and then
I think there's a bit of a myth to associate the rise of these parties with the recession. If you look back the last 20, 30 years, these movements begin in Europe, not in the poorest, but in the most prosperous parts of Europe. The Lombardy League, for example, the richest part of Italy, the Flanders right-wing nationalists, one of the richest parts of Europe. You look at the Catalonian movements, which are entirely contemptuous of Andalusian working-class people, and you look around the Front National, and they're kind of based in many parts of southern France near fairly prosperous areas. And I think there's a myth to confuse the debates today with the interwar period. In the interwar period, the polarization took place around capital and labor as being the principal issue at stake. Today, the big debates in Europe are values related. They're about cultural conflicts. And if you look at why there's the growth of these movements, you'll find that when you talk to the people that support them, what drives them on more than anything is not poverty, it's not the economic recession, it's a profound sense of cultural uncertainty, a sense of estrangement from their own society, and an estrangement from the political system. And I think there's a danger of conflating what's been happening the last few years with a much, much longer trend that's been going around ever since the early 80s, which seems to be getting stronger and stronger all the time, and which is entirely independent from the economic recession, except for a few cases like Greece and a few other. But everywhere else, it's a cultural dynamic that's at work, which we need to understand much more and fight against. If we don't understand it, then we're going to be fighting the battles of the interwar period rather than of the 21st century.
Okay, so I'm going to bring the panel back in for 1 minute.
I totally agree on that.
Yeah, 1 minute each, but we will be pursuing that kind of discussion very shortly in the second debate this evening. So if you've got questions around about that, please save them for that. So to sum up, a minute each. I'll start with Kaiser for a change.
Yeah, first of all, I refute this term, these parties, because you can't compare the Catalonian freedom movement, I mean, with far-right parties in the rest of Europe. I mean, Catalonia has been fighting for freedom for many, many years because essentially it is a country oppressed by Spain. So this has nothing to do with it. Second of all, I think it's very clear that recession plays a part. The golden years of Europe, I mean, 45 to 73, completely crisis-free years, also didn't see the rise of fascism anywhere, except Spain, where Franco was already in power, but that was a residue from the previous fascist wave. So, of course, we see that after the oil crisis in 73, and we start again having increasing class gaps, and we see again these movements, as you were just saying, in the beginning of the 80s, which was when gaps started increasing again in Europe, and we have neo-fascist parties coming back. I mean, so obviously there is a relation. And I think we also need to look at the power of community and the power of a sense of community that somebody mentioned. I mean, we have a society in which a lot of people feel like, yeah, they don't belong. They might not find a job. I mean, unemployment is very permanent. Even if you do find a job as a young person, it's not a permanent job. Even if you do find an apartment, it's maybe a second-hand or third-hand contract. Even for young boys that used to go to the army and feel like they belonged somewhere, I mean, now you don't even get to do that. So you have a feeling growing up in the society that you're not needed. Nobody needs you. You're not wanted. You're just like, you know, there for your own sake. You have to go and realize your dreams. So in that, of course, nationalism provides a very powerful idea that you belong here. You have somewhere where you belong. And if we look at the threshold to get into, for example, or to vote for a party such as the Sweden Democrats, I mean, you don't have to be like super smart. You don't have to know a million terms. You don't have to have gone to university. You don't even have to be Swedish, as somebody mentioned. I mean, you can be from anywhere and just say, I've had enough of immigrants, or not even immigrants. You can say, I've had enough of everything. You know, and that's enough for you to belong. And then they say, welcome, come in here. You know, I think the left has a much more powerful dream, actually, the dream of equality between everyone. The problem is to get into the left is like harder than getting into university. I mean, really, you need to know all these things. I mean, you need to use all the right words that change every third day. And then, you know, you have to use them the right way and stuff like that. And if they think you're strange, you don't belong. So I think the left, unfortunately, should pursue the old dream of equality and appeal to everyone instead of, you know, going the elitist way, which we're doing now. And I'm a Democrat, you know, which means that I think we should have democracy everywhere, even in the production of goods and services, and bring back democracy to the people.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll let you applaud at the end. Anna-Lena.
Okay, just short. I was the one who was talking about maybe a little bit getting into the media. The media is very important because those kind of parties are more or less designed for media, you could say. I mean, they have this simple messages, strong leadership. They are working very well with certain kind of tabloid press, particularly. You can see that. And they are, I mean, even if they're presenting loads of articles about how bad they are and what they're doing, they're still gaining from it because they are actually presented in a way that makes them even more interesting for some of the people that are going to vote for them. So it's, I mean, I still think it's very good that you discover things and say that they're doing this and that, and investigating journalism about those kind of parties is very important. But still, I'm sad to say, usually they gain from it.
Okay, and finally, Sabina.
Yeah, I think that often we try to find simple explanations for what's going on, and that we say, well, it's because of globalization, it's because of the recession, it's because Germany is becoming so strong again. But I also think that we need to look very carefully at what exactly is happening, and I think that a lot of it is really to do with confusion as to what we want in Europe. And I would say I would actually include these left-wing groups into this very, very strong confusion, because there has been a drive towards dividing societies. There has been a drive towards, actually lowering horizons rather than widening horizons, looking at, everybody looking at their own identity as what is special about us, which I think is not a long-term strategy at all. And I think really what we need is very, very new solutions and very specific solutions to what is happening at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Can we thank our panel, please?